I was just about to do some housekeeping and say, can everyone mute themselves? Right, let's get going and allow people to join as they can. So, hello and welcome. My name's Steffan Eldred from Innovate UKKTN. So welcome to our hydrogen event. This forms part of the Green Infrastructure Week 2022. Sponsored by AECOM. So it's a week of insight and commentary curated by over 25 partners to highlight the technologies and innovations that will be needed to deliver the biggest gains in our global transition to net zero. So you can go online to greeninfrastructureweek.com and find out all about the other events that are happening, the timetable, because there's lots going on. So please do that. Obviously, once you've listened to our event. So if we can just go on to the next slide, I'll just do some welcome and housekeeping. So you should find that as delegates, you are muted throughout this webinar, but you should have a chat function. So if you wish to either introduce yourselves or sort of communicate with other delegates, then you can use the chat function, which is down at the bottom for that. But also you have a Q&A icon at the bottom, so a Q&A box. Please do use that. That's what we're going to use for our Q&A session towards the end of today's event. So any questions you've got for our speakers, we won't be having a Q&A session at the end of each speaker. Pop it in there. I'll be keeping an eye out on it, and we'll ask those towards the end. My colleague Chloe is on hand for any technical issues. She's running the show behind the scenes today. You should be able to get subtitles if you need them if you go to the live transcript icon at the bottom of the toolbar. And you should have heard as you came on, but this is being recorded. So it's being recorded and a link will be published on the Green Infrastructure page after the event. So Chloe, you can just move us on to the next slide, please. So as per the title, today we're looking at the journey from pilot project to scale delivery for hydrogen. We recognise that to make a difference to net zero and beyond, really, we need scale. We need to scale up our ambitions and our actions to reap the rewards from the great work that's happening across the UK, and we're going to hear about some of that shortly. Today's session is in the form of a sort of roundtable discussion. So we've got some great speakers who'll share what they're up to and share their views, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussion towards the end. So I'll just say a quick bit about the Innovate UKKTN Innovation Network shortly. Then we'll move on to Toby from AECOM. We've then got Dr. Oliver Taylor from BP Aberdeen Hydrogen Energy. Richard will then come in from Turbo Machinery and Process Solutions, and then Oonagh Grady, who's the head of hydrogen development from SSE Thermal. But as you can see on the agenda, we've then got plenty of time for Q&A, so please do keep popping those in the box. I'll keep an eye out for them and queue those up towards the end. Okay, so next slide, Chloe. So yeah, I lead on hydrogen at Innovate UKKTN, and we set up a non-competitive advisory group, so the Hydrogen Economy Innovation Network. We spent quite a bit of time, like 18 months ago now, trying to establish exactly which part of hydrogen we needed to play that role in. And the end use came up time and time again. So I suppose it's chicken and egg, isn't it? So it's do we focus on in particular the clean and the green hydrogen production, as KTN I'm referring to here, or the end use side of things. And time again, we were speaking to our trade associations, our networks, government organisations, and it was as industrial end users will all be on a journey to net zero. They will all have sustainability strategies, and hydrogen will feature in all of those. But sometimes they don't know the finer detail of how that is going to work on their, as you can see in the pictures, in the glass sector or on their asphalt plant or cement plant. And so we felt with our connections and our regional connections across the UK, we could help to try and unlock that. So we're a totally non-competitive advisory group, and we're looking to help enable local clean hydrogen uptake at scale and help find innovative solutions to those. I think there's a link at the end, but you can find us on, either just Google KTN and hydrogen, or you can find myself on LinkedIn. Okay, so without further ado, I think it's time for me to hand over to our first speaker. So Toby Uppingham is Senior Vice President of Energy from AECOM. Hi, Toby.
Many thanks, Steffan, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be, to everyone that's joined. Thank you very much for your time today. Maybe just a quick few words around AECOM. For those of you that don't know us, and for those of you that do know us, we are a pure infrastructure firm, and our role is to work with clients to help them select the right infrastructure for the challenges they have to operate their businesses, to agree the development of that infrastructure with all the appropriate stakeholders, and then develop designs, permitting, solutions to then procure and install and manage the construction of that infrastructure. And then once in place, optimize the performance of that infrastructure for our clients. In the case of hydrogen, we kind of start off with two questions. Firstly, hydrogen. Is hydrogen the right solution for the challenge that our client is trying to solve? We spend a lot of time trying to work out how to adopt hydrogen and where it is appropriate to do so, develop a solution that is suitable, but also to be cognizant of the other options that may be available. Once we're comfortable that hydrogen is the solution for the challenge that our clients are facing, we then move to the second question, which is more around hydrogen. How do you incorporate that hydrogen solution into their business plan for both the existing and new infrastructure requirements that they need to operate? If we can move on, Chloe, we've thought to the questions that we have associated with this panel session, the journey from pilot to scale delivery. Chloe, the next slide, please. As Steffan has sort of quite succinctly set out, that there's a lot of conversation around the chicken and the egg. That conversation tends to focus on how hydrogen is produced and how hydrogen is used. And those are very critical elements in the scaling of infrastructure and developing economies of scale. One of the issues we'd argue tends to get overlooked a little bit is the bit in the middle, the transportation and storage infrastructure required to get the hydrogen from where it's produced to where it is used. And if you look at the chicken and the egg industry, I postulate that actually it's the egg box and refrigeration that have enabled that industry to scale. In terms of scaling infrastructure, we have learned that the best way to do so is clearly to make it as easy as possible and to work with all of those involved in the framework of delivering infrastructure to make it as simple and cost effective to deliver. That includes working with stakeholders around acceptance, getting the right legislation in place, working to inform the capital markets to make things affordable, and bringing best practice to bear. It's not just about making it easy, it's also about making sure we capture the benefits and publicize the success. Scaled infrastructure has to be bought into by all stakeholders, and they need to want to make it to happen. Otherwise, things will tend to stall. That development of positive feedback in terms of supply and demand is really enabled by making hydrogen available, affordable, and reliable, and pulling together integrated programs, as I said already, around making it very easy to get the hydrogen where you want it, when you want it, in a form that you can safely rely upon. That's simple to a degree when you're looking at new infrastructure. One of the bigger challenges will be around retrofitting hydrogen infrastructure into existing infrastructure plays and managing the phased adoption of hydrogen from existing energy sources. That will be a critical point in the scaling of the infrastructure. Getting all of those aligned building blocks in place to allow hydrogen to be moved around, produced, and used isn't just about the hydrogen atoms themselves, it's also about all the enabling infrastructure that's required to make things work. One of the critical elements in that space will be the power grid. The requirement for grid modernization, not only for green hydrogen production, will be key at scale in major industrial centers, but also to allow decentralized production of hydrogen at the point of use. The coordination of all of these individual building blocks and all the associated infrastructure for the hydrogen economy will be critical. And perhaps maybe as a last thought, the other thing I'd like us to think a little bit around is how we also capture the value from the byproducts associated with the production and usage of hydrogen. That could be creating a parallel oxygen economy. It could be using the waste heat from hydrogen processes. It could be around scaled water industry, not only for hydrogen production, but also for wider societal demands. With that, I think I'll leave it there. And Steffan, hand back to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Toby. Much appreciated and very thought-provoking. If anyone's got any questions for Toby, please do put them in the Q&A box. I know I've jotted down a few thoughts there. And now we're going to hand over to Dr. Oliver Taylor. Hi, Oliver. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Steffan. So very nice to meet everyone. So my name is Oliver Taylor. I work for BP. I actually sit within our global cities practice, and I'm chief executive of a brand new public-private partnership that we've announced with City, with Aberdeen, which is really focused around creating a citywide, regional, and then European hydrogen development hub. If we maybe step on to the next slide, please, Chloe. I'll just quickly talk to that. So back in February 2020, BP announced a brand new strategy. That strategy is seeing BP transition from international oil company to an integrated energy company. Within that, we set about particular aims and a vision, and underpinning that net zero 2050 vision, we have commitments to develop up to 50 gigawatts of renewable net generating capacity by 2030, a significant expansion in EV charging points, and particularly relevant today, securing up to 10% of core hydrogen markets. Within that strategy, we also announced an ambition to work with cities and with large corporations. So why did we do that? Well, we know that today cities consume something like 2/3 of global energy, and they're responsible for something around 70% of global CO2 emissions. So if you're committed to achieving the Paris Agreement goals or better, and to getting to net zero, you can reasonably argue that you need some kind of a relationship with cities. So we're looking to work with between 10 and 15 cities by 2030. And we've announced partnerships now with Aberdeen, and I'll talk a little bit about the ambitions of the Aberdeen partnership. We've also announced partnerships with Houston and also with Valencia. Chloe, if we chip on to the next slide. This slide really talks to, I guess, what I would describe as some of the key infrastructure elements of the joint venture we've set up with Aberdeen. This joint venture has a sort of a phased development approach as we expand into the growing hydrogen market. But really, it's underpinned by three key themes. There's a key theme around social and economic development for the city. So that is transitioning a city who historically had been a sort of really recognized for oil and gas production, probably arguably the oil and gas capital of Europe, and transitioning with them in net zero to transition them to become a global center of excellence for renewable power generation and also green hydrogen production. It's also a story around integration, so bringing together a number of different elements of an energy value chain, from production of energy through renewables, through to production of green hydrogen, through splitting of water through electrolyzers, and dispensing hydrogen for use in transport applications in the short term, and then in the medium and longer term, transitioning for industrial uses of hydrogen and also export. It's also a story around how to deliver net zero at the city level. And what I would say is that with the cities that we are collaborating with, it's apparent that each city is unique and different solutions will be best suited to different cities. It's also apparent that there's a lot of exploration that's needed to help design the right kind of systems and to explore and find out, well, how can we jointly get to net zero? I don't think anyone has the answer just yet. What we are building within this joint venture in the first phase is hydrogen production linked to supply of fuel to public buses, the transport buses that are used within Aberdeen today, which are being expanded. So around 25 buses, a similar number of heavy goods vehicles, and also offtake by private fleets within the city as well. That initial project is then expanded as we move into phase 2 between 25 and 2030. And that sees increased production of hydrogen, up to 10 megawatts of production, and that's enough to supply fuel for around 140 heavy goods vehicles. Around that time, we also envisage testing use of hydrogen in non-transport applications. So that could be things like district heating use to decarbonize use of heating within the city. And then in phase 3, expanding that to link into a significant offshore wind development, which was announced as part of the Crown Estate Scotland licensing rounds recently, where BP and partner EnBW have secured just under a 3 gigawatt license option, and using that to produce at scale kind of green hydrogen for domestic use and also for export, or certainly some of that power volume. I'll pause there. That's the sort of the ambition of the joint venture. Like I say, it's really around economic and social development of the city, so creating this infrastructure to stimulate training and skills, to help stimulate supply chain development and to deliver wider community benefits, but really underpinned by a hydrogen infrastructure that we can establish and put into place today, with a vision of phasing in this way to 2030 and beyond. So Steffan, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. That's really useful, and I've seen a couple of questions come through, so I'm sure that will prompt some discussion. Now we have Richard Noyes. So Richard is Account Director at Turbo Machinery and Process Solutions, Baker Hughes. Hi, Richard, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you loud and clear. Over to you. Yeah.
Super. Very good. So thanks, Steffan. And thanks for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with everybody and talk about Baker Hughes. So I'm Rich Noyes, Account Director for Baker Hughes, focused on the development of strategic relationships with both customers and partners. For those of you who aren't familiar with Baker Hughes, we're a global energy technology company with a very deep heritage in the oil and gas sector. We're now focused on how we can apply our learnings from oil and gas along with new technologies in resolving the energy challenges of the future. Globally, we have around 54,000 employees serving customers in over 120 different countries. And we got a 2021 revenue of approximately $20 billion. But within the UK alone, we have over 4,000 employees working in 35 different facilities. And we export globally from the UK with a supply chain of over 3,000 UK suppliers. So it's a very important region for us in particular. Chloe, if you want to move on to the next slide. Super, thank you. So for those of you who don't know Baker Hughes, just a bit of background around what we do, as well as some of the illustrations here around our hydrogen capabilities in particular. But we consist of 4 key product companies, and each of those are playing their own role in the energy transition. We are, from a hydrogen perspective, across production, transportation, and utilization in the different areas of our business. From an overall perspective, we have an oil field services and an oil field equipment business that leverage their core subsurface competencies, in particular to enable large-scale storage of both carbon dioxide and hydrogen, very relevant to the energy transition, and in particular with some significant experience in salt cavern storage, which is one of the future enablers for hydrogen for sure. In addition, we also manufacture composite flexible pipeline technology here in the UK that is very well suited to the transportation with hydrogen. We have a digital solutions business that enables inspection, measurement and sensing, along with some asset performance management technologies that we can use across the hydrogen value chain. And then finally, and not least, the part of the business that I actually work for, which is Turbo Machinery Process Solutions. This is historically focused on rotating equipment. We are the world leader in the equipment for the liquefaction of natural gas. But our hydrogen experience is also particularly broad. We've been providing hydrogen compression technology since 1962. Moreover, in 2008, we built the first turbine in the world to run on 100% hydrogen for a power project in Italy. And we've continued to invest in that hydrogen capability in turbines and now have commercially available turbines capable of burning hydrogen blended fuel gas from 10% up to 100%. In addition, considering the broader aspects of the energy transition, we've also got our own suite of proprietary post-combustion carbon capture technologies, which will be equally important moving forwards. We're continuing to invest in sustainable energy technology for tomorrow, and we aim to accelerate the adoption and deployment of new fuel sources and emission solutions. And crucially, as Baker Hughes, we see three particular truths around the energy transition. Firstly, an unfortunate truth, the global reliance on hydrocarbons isn't going anywhere anytime soon, so efficiency really matters. I think even in the most aggressive transition scenarios, hydrocarbons' role is an inescapable fact. But we need to make sure that we are as efficient as possible in burning those hydrocarbons to make sure emissions are as limited as possible. But secondly, without acceleration, and hinting towards a lot of the discussion we'll have later today, the world will not meet the net zero targets. So the technologies we have today in reducing emissions will get us some way there, but they're insufficient to get us to the Paris Agreement goals. Therefore, we've got to look at both efficiency and emissions reductions while we invest in the new energy solutions for the future. I think thirdly, and probably most important, is there's no path to net zero without partnership and collaboration. As Baker Hughes, we know well about the power of partnership and service. But moving forwards, I think it's really more critical than ever that both energy producers, technology service providers, energy buyers, policymakers, communities at large, you name it, all work closely to achieve the collective ambitions. It's not going to be one party that makes this happen themselves. And just to close from my side of this introduction, and in the context of today's discussion, I think it's also important to note hydrogen alone is not the answer to the challenge. I think Toby's comment about hydrogen and hydrogen resonates very loud. It's a truly significant component of a much broader suite of different options that we have to look at collectively. And some of those solutions are also going to require a lot of acceleration in order to get us where we need to be for the future. But reflecting on the UK opportunity, in particular with hydrogen, I think the work we've done with renewable energy development and infrastructure puts us in a really, really solid place to take full advantage of hydrogen for the future. Thank you. So Steffan, I'll hand it back to you if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That's great. And again, I can see questions coming in. Just a reminder, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm making a note of those, making sure we've got them ready so we can have our live Q&A session after our next speaker. So our next speaker is Oonagh O'Grady, Head of Hydrogen Development at SSE Thermal. So over to you.
Thank you, Steffan, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of the panel. My own role is Head of Hydrogen Development at SSE Thermal, which is a directorate of SSE Group. It's a FTSE 100 company, for those of you that are not familiar with it, and it is involved right across the energy value chain. I suppose most notably for renewable development, and in particular offshore wind. We are currently building, I think, more offshore wind than anybody else in the world. In addition to that, with those ambitions, we do have to have the investment to be able to back that up. And we have recently announced our net zero acceleration programme, which will see SSE commit to investing 12.5 billion over the next 5 years. And for anyone who can do the maths in their head, thankfully someone did it for me, that equates to 7 million per day over that period. The part of the business that I represent is SSE Termal. And SSE Termal is responsible for the operation and now the decarbonisation of our flexible gas generation portfolio across the UK and Ireland. We also operate approximately, together with Equinor, about 40% of the gas storage facilities across the UK, and that's through salt cavern technology, both at Aldeburgh with Equinor and Attic as standalone SSE. Just moving on to the next slide, please. Within SSE Termal, we have two options for decarbonisation of our power portfolio. The first is post-combustion carbon capture, and even though that is not the topic of today's conversation, our projects will look to underpin and be key anchoring projects for the CCS or carbon capture infrastructure within some of the industrial clusters. Moving on to the hydrogen side of things, we last year signed a memorandum of understanding and cooperation agreement with Equinor to look to develop within the Humber region a full value chain proposition with regards to hydrogen. So SSE and Equinor have had a long and established presence within the Humber region, but also have collaborated previously on the likes of Dogger Bank, which is currently under construction. Within the Humber region, we have, I suppose, firstly, it does need to be said that any value chain is about collaboration right across the value chain. And a key enabler for the project I'm about to step through is actually the dual pipeline, the CO2 pipeline and hydrogen pipeline that National Grid Ventures are developing right across the Humber. That coupled with the offshore infrastructure being developed by Oliver's colleagues in BP, National Grid Ventures, Equinor and others. And then what that has unlocked, not only for SSE and Equinor, but for many others across the Humber estuary, is the ability to develop decarbonised projects. From a hydrogen perspective, for us, that means a hydrogen power station at our Keepy site, which we will look to be 100% hydrogen from the get-go. We also unlocks a blending opportunity at Keepy 2, which is our due to come online shortly, power station, 900 megawatt power station at the Keepy site. But in addition to that, we also recognise between ourselves and Equinor the importance of the storage, which has already been mentioned earlier, to balance that supply and demand. And therefore, at our Aldeburgh site, we are going to look to develop hydrogen storage right at the same site as our current gas storage facility. All of this, as I said, is enabled by that dual pipeline running across the Humber, and shows, I suppose, the collaboration of 14 companies coming together, putting their competitiveness to one side and seeing if that pipeline comes to the Humber, it unlocks opportunities for us all. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Just moving on to the next slide. And that brings me to how can these opportunities be unlocked? So I think the first is government targets, which we have seen firstly in the hydrogen strategy and emphasised with the investment plans that the government announced both for hydrogen and CCS just over 2 weeks ago. That has enabled, I suppose, discussions to move to business models, which are key for not only the early development and certainty to invest within these infrastructure projects, but also the scaling up, because it gives long-term certainty for those larger investments. In addition to that, I touched on it earlier, but the collaboration aspect, and I think the Innovate UK and UKRI have played a really important role within this. Following on from the industrial strategy, what the UKRI and Innovate UK through the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge Fund actually gave I suppose, seed funding to these clusters to actually establish themselves. And while the monetary aspect was exceptionally important, it was actually that structure to collaborate was exceptionally important also, and actually allowed projects like I've shown on the previous slide to happen. And the final point I would make is, and I think again it was touched on by previous speakers, is the need for public acceptance and the need for government to see not only the environmental return for projects like these, but also the socio-economic return that large infrastructure projects like this can bring, particularly in the area of jobs and particularly in the area of reactivating and revitalizing these industrial heartlands across the UK. We see this as a just transition, and all of us within Zero Carbon Humber, within the East Coast Cluster, have very much put a focus on this, because it's not only the environmental decarbonisation and reduction in emissions that make the difference here and show a return on investment. It is also the job creation, the supply chain, and ensuring that we bring the public along with us as we develop these projects. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Oonagh. Really thought-provoking. So I think, Chloe, if yeah, I was going to say, if I've got the agenda right, then the next slide should be about Q&A. So if you want to stop sharing the slides, because we'll do this live, and if the panelists or speakers want to turn their cameras on. We've had quite a few questions coming in, so I'm trying to make sure I keep up with them. And what I just wanted to do actually was just pick up on a point, Toby, that you made at the start. So partly, I suppose it's comment really, which is completely agree on, and really like your why hydrogen at the start. So when you have people coming to you and your first challenge or your first role is to help advise whether hydrogen is or isn't suitable for that. I mean, I think we come across that a lot in Innovate UK KTN, and there's been a lot said about it. Things like Michael Liebrecht's hydrogen ladder, I think, really helps people to sort of understand and fit that in. So I suppose from your point of view, what needs to be taken into account for the pilot project to scale up successfully, and what are the issues you're seeing coming in? So what are the main occurring issues that are kind of stopping that scale up when they come into you?
Yeah, no, thanks. And look, Rich said it himself. Hydrogen is an answer. It is not the only answer. The biggest challenge and opportunity associated with hydrogen is to replace the current, very common, well-used, well-understood liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons that are used for a variety of purposes. Society has become used to the storage, the distribution, the production and use of hydrocarbons to perform a full variety of functions safely and affordably. And unless hydrogen can replicate or better that, it is going to struggle. There's a good question in the Q&A around why Aberdeen is going down a hydrogen bus route versus an electric bus route. You could take mobility as an example. Hydrogen is a fuel that when put into storage, it disperses as water, as we all know. Therefore, the weight of that fuel disappears as it is used. A battery will retain its weight for its entire life cycle as it moves around. Therefore, the utility of battery vehicles are very good for short scale journeys and smaller vehicles, but tend to struggle at larger scale. Therefore, hydrogen is an option to replace hydrocarbon fuels for heavier mobility. And even in that case, it doesn't have to be the only option. But there's a really interesting product coming to market with Teva, which is actually a hydrogen range extender to a battery powered vehicle. Therefore, you're combining the benefits of both electric vehicles to do the day-to-day 80% moving around, but should you get to a point where your battery runs out of power, you can then kick into a hydrogen fuel cell to get your vehicle back to base or to the nearest charger. I put that forward merely as an example and maybe to move the conversation on a little bit, Steffan.
Yeah, no, that's great. And shameless plug that I probably should have said at the start, but as part of the Innovation Network, we have a podcast, Hydro Generally, and we had an episode, I think it was episode 2, with Joanna Richard from Ricardo, and she spoke exactly about this sort of scenario and mentioned about, you know, the buses, and that, you know, obviously different uses fit different environments. Just to move the conversation on, I just wonder if it's worth allowing Oliver to just comment on that point. It's not, perhaps not focusing on the buses, but just the, you know, the question that came in from Edward Baker Martins about why Aberdeen are adopting hydrogen fuel buses. I just wondered if you had anything from Aberdeen's perspective on that side of things.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Steffan. And it's a really good question. And I think the observation is absolutely accurate. And we look at a number of cities that we work with. Some of those choose electrification, so particularly actually battery electrification for some of their in-city buses. And Aberdeen's got a different route. So you could reasonably ask, well, why go to hydrogen-powered bus fleets? And there's probably, I guess, a couple of key answers to that. One, when you step back and you look at the challenge that Aberdeen has, and the opportunity through the energy transition is to transition from oil and gas capital to hydrogen and renewables capital of Europe. So the question they're asking themselves today is, well, what do we need to have in place to be able to get to that future vision? And if you're going to be a leader in renewables and hydrogen, you need a strong supply chain. You need training and skills. You need to transition the talent pool that currently exists to be able to develop that. And you need fundamental access to resources like offshore wind, like access to ports and export markets. So actually for Aberdeen, the motivation around hydrogen buses, yes, it is to get to net zero, but it's also to create that infrastructure that can stimulate the supply chain, that can help stimulate the training and skills requirement to get to their vision of becoming climate positive at the heart of the energy transition. I would just echo Toby's comments as well, that, and I think there's another question in here which says something like, you know, electric will be the solution for all transport on land. And we see that actually the conversations, the demand that we have from customers today is multifaceted. So actually customers are interested in multiple different fuel types to get their current fleets to net zero. So that could be around things like biofuels, it could be around transition fuels like gas, it could be around electrification, increasingly is in the passenger car sector, or it could be around hydrogen. Our view, which I think is consistent with what Toby was saying, is that it's quite hard to decarbonize heavy goods transport over long distances other than through hydrogen. So that's very much where our focus is for hydrogen refueling networks within the company, and underpins some of the other the kind of strategic partnerships that we have in that space. Great,
thank you. Yeah. Just to pick up on something that you mentioned there that I'd already got jotted down, I think, I mean, any of these questions, by the way, any panelists, feel free to comment. I think I would sort of, aiming at this at you, Oliver, but actually I think Oonagh might have some comments around, you know, like you said, revitalizing the sort of heartlands. So just with, you mentioned there, I think, about training and skill set. So I suppose particularly people will be looking to people like BP with your huge, you know, oil and gas experience, huge employer over many years. You know, you should be well placed to ensure that we're retraining and have the skill set in place so that people are ready to deal with the sort of the hydrogen future. And I suppose, so, you know, any comments on that and what BP are doing around, you know, the skill set and the retraining side. And I suppose, Oonagh, just your thoughts as well on what are you either seeing in the areas you're dealing with, or what's the gap, what's the need? But perhaps yeah, Oliver, if you go first.
Yeah, sure. So let me comment on that just quickly. So within our sort of our net zero frame, we have 20 aims. You could argue that 20 is perhaps too many. But aim 12 is what we call just transition. I think that phrase is something that that a number of you will be familiar with. And that really recognizes the ambition that we have as a company to transition our talent pools, our staff that have and do work in kind of hydrocarbons into some future state, and also to bring those regions along with us that have been so core to the company's success over the last 100 or so years. So that challenge is multifaceted. The joint venture that I'm heading up has key contribution to make towards that, and particularly leadership in training and skills development in hydrogen within the Aberdeen region, and also particularly around stimulating supply chain. But actually the company's ambitions go far beyond that. And are really underpinned by some really strong capability in our people and culture teams.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Oonagh, I just wondered if you had any comments on the sort of the skills need, training need.
Yeah, I think most definitely. So firstly, I think if we look back to COP, which was only a couple of months ago, SSE was one of the principal partners of COP, and a key theme for us was just transition. So we actually took the step as a company, I think probably one of the first companies, to actually issue a just transition strategy. And for us, we can see that happening already. So for example, within that strategy, it notes that already within SSE, one in four of our employees have actually transitioned to low carbon jobs already. Now that is on the renewable side of the business, but we see that happening as, you know, we build up our thermal business with regards to hydrogen. The second is with regards to trainees. For example, within our power stations, we have taken in apprentices over the last number of months. And the exciting part about that is that it's bridging the generations. So they are learning and being trained by people who have operated power stations on gas or on even coal in the past. And in the future, those same apprentices are going to be operating power stations, decarbonized power stations using hydrogen. So it's not about tearing out the new or tearing out the old and bringing in the new. It's about that bridge, and it's about that just transition. I think the other part is it's also, there's an onus on us as you know, companies that understand the skill set that's going to need to be required to actually be active in invigorating that within universities. And I suppose, you know, having that close relationship with universities and with training entities to identify the skill sets that are going to be required for the future. I certainly see already within our organization a shift in the graduates that are coming in. So traditionally it was electrical, but now you're seeing much more of the chemical skill set coming into our organizations. So I think it's threefold. It's look at it as a just transition. It's don't throw out the old, look to see how you can adapt it. And then I think thirdly, it's about that really close relationship with academic institutions to ensure we're identifying the skill sets we'll need. And the final point I'd make is just about learning from the offshore wind experience. While we now see supply chain jobs coming to the UK, that probably was a lesson learned from the first and initial rounds of offshore wind. And I think learning from that within this new industry that we're seeing that supply chain here in the UK as much as possible.
Great.
Steffan, if I could just quickly add, and I'd agree with everything that Oliver and Oonagh have just said, but what I'd like to build on is the skills question is definitely critical, but it's not unique to the producers and the users. And what we've learned in successfully delivering new infrastructure at scale is we have to bring the skill set of the regulators and those that we work with up at the same level. Some of the challenges associated with the consenting for KEB, Oonagh, you and I know, it involves educating and bringing people to a place where they're comfortable and willing to advance that infrastructure at speed and at scale. So it's not just the producers, it's the regulators, and that point around just transition and getting societal comfort up is also a really critical point.
Great. Yeah, no, makes total sense. Thank you very much. And a question that's just come in, I'll put it to you, Richard, but again, anybody feel free to comment, from Jonathan Swan. Hi, Jonathan. I think sort of builds on that a little bit as well. So if we've got hydrogen producers but are we confident that the OEM manufacturers are moving at sufficient pace to match the hydrogen production growth? Any thoughts, Richard?
No, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a little bit chicken and egg again in terms of how the hydrogen economy is going to work. And I see Adam's question there as well around the price of hydrogen. Burning hydrogen is fairly well understood. So we can give you 100% hydrogen fuel gas turbine in a project in the coming years, no problem. But that hydrogen has got to come from somewhere, and it's got to be at an affordable price. So I think the availability of hydrogen at a price that makes a project competitive is going to be really important. And for OEMs to put technology in the marketplace that can burn that hydrogen, equally, they need to know there's a market there. So I do see it as a little bit chicken and egg. I think in terms of internal combustion engines, the technology is there, it's understood and can be done. So I don't see a big OEM issue from a technology perspective in terms of capacity. I think there's probably a little pause while we understand exactly what the use case is going to be and the volumes of hydrogen around and how it's going to be priced. I think that is a really interesting question.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, there's a couple coming in thick and fast, which is great. It's really, really good to have them live, just trying to make sure I do.
Steffan, maybe just whilst you digest those, yeah. Just a comment I had made in the introduction is the importance of managing the transition. People already have existing energy infrastructure and existing processes that they are trying to run that run on usually carbon intensive energy. Switching to hydrogen isn't normally quite as simple as flicking a switch. You're going to have to bring in that new infrastructure and integrate it into existing infrastructure plays. And something that the OEMs, I think, are doing quite successfully, and actually Oonagh laid it out in her comparison with KEBE 2 versus KEBE 3, is the ability to blend hydrogen in over time and manage that transition. And there's a real role with those OEMs to have solutions that are able to initially run on, say, natural gas, blend hydrogen through all the way through to 100% to make that transition as smooth as possible. I think that makes the infrastructure development much easier. It makes the financing much easier. And whilst it may not be a binary switch in terms of the carbon benefit, I think it may actually allow us to scale far more successfully.
If I might come in on that, Toby, and yeah, that's absolutely the case, certainly in terms of gas turbine technology. You don't want to spend money today on something that is obsolete in a few years' time. So putting in natural gas today that is purely natural gas comes with an element of risk. If you can put something in place today that you can migrate, as you say, through blends and ultimately ending up at 100% hydrogen, it's future-proof, but you also have a roadmap to net zero, which is really critical to every operator. And that's certainly exactly as we see our strategy moving forward as Baker Hughes. We're deploying this as a model around the world, and we certainly see it has real opportunity for the future.
And I think it's also about the needs case. So the needs case needs a strong anchor to, I suppose, unlock its potential and show its needs case and attract that investment. So it's about how you can build the needs case while you're transitioning. And for example, we know that all of the OEMs, the new space race is to get to the hydrogen ready turbine. That's going to happen this decade. We're confident of that. But we need to underpin the infrastructure in the meantime to not only unlock power, but to, as power can act as an anchor, it then means that infrastructure is in place for a wider hydrogen economy to build. So it's thinking about it strategically of what is that needs case at the very beginning for the infrastructure.
I'd agree, if I might jump in, Steffan. I think when we talk about accelerating from pilot to scale, one of the things that I think is really important is that we don't look at science projects here. These have got to be really practical cases that really prove the technology and prove that the commercial model works on a very practical level. Otherwise, we'll miss the point. And I think that's bad press around these projects is as damaging as anything else we can put out there. So they've got to be successful and applied in the right place at the right time, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just Oonagh, questions coming to you, which I think is particularly relevant. So it's really commenting on the fact that you were, of the speakers, you really highlighted the, industrial user, that being British Steel Scunthorpe site. So just, any comments really on that connection? They're obviously involved and proactive. So
yeah, sure. I certainly won't speak on behalf of British Steel, but I will maybe speak on the behalf of Zero Carbon Humber and the initiative that's about. So I talk a lot about power, decarbonisation of power, but I think the hint is in the actual initiative here by Innovate UK, UKRI and the government. It's about decarbonising industrial uses. And that's where our base case emissions come from. So when we talk about 12.4 million tonnes of CO2 base case emissions in the Humber, a lot of that comes from industry powers on top of that. So again, I suppose not talking specifically about British Steel, but the idea here is that power players have what I would call a stick. We have to decarbonise. We have an ambition by 2035. By us going first or providing that anchor, what we ensure is that by time industrials are looking to decarbonise, which a lot are looking to do now, that infrastructure is in place for them to tap into. So it means not only are we decarbonising the power system, but we are also enabling and ensuring that when the industrial decarbonisation is ready to happen, that infrastructure, all important enabling infrastructure, is in place. And the other point I would make is that you will notice it's a dual pipeline. It's both CO2 and it's hydrogen, meaning it's giving optionality with regards to decarbonisation of those processes. So it has the optionality, and that is one of the key, I suppose, attractive aspects of the Humber onshore pipeline project.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, so this is great, and more questions are coming in. I want to make sure we do justice to as many of them as possible in the next sort of 5 minutes or so. So just I've got one here that David Dundas put in earlier on, and it sort of fits with one from John Williams. So I think they're kind of aimed at Toby and Oliver. So David said about the demand for fuel cell grade hydrogen is greater than the rate that the electrolytic hydrogen can be ramped up. So it's really about, do we see an immediate role for grey hydrogen replaced by blue hydrogen as CCUS is ramped up, and then replaced by green? So do we see that role? And I suppose John had a comment, which I think was directed at Oliver, John Williams, around where does CCUS work at scale? It's not a long-term solution, but I think it fits in with that overarching of, do we have do we see that immediate role for grey, blue, and into green? Any thoughts on that? Toby or Oliver? Yeah.
Sorry, do you want me to go first, or?
Please do, Oliver.
Yeah, sure. So look, I think so. This question around different colours of hydrogen, I think probably the kind of primary couple I mentioned there, probably blue, green, and grey. There are actually sort of a number of different options, and I guess what it comes down to is the customer that you're working with, so be that a city or corporate, and their access to energy, and what that implies in terms of kind of short, medium, and long-term solutions to get to net zero. What we find in Aberdeen is a real focus on green hydrogen, and I think strategically that makes sense given the availability of renewable power as a result of offshore wind development. But if you look elsewhere, you can see bias towards blue hydrogen. So that's hydrogen that's generated from natural gas, where the carbon dioxide is captured and then stored offshore. Where we see actually, and I think the sort of the real focus of this question is the role for grey hydrogen. We actually do see that, and if we look at Valencia as one of our city relationships, there's a real appetite to get into action to prove the technical case for the role of hydrogen in decarbonising industrial processes in and around Valencia. Valencia has a big ceramics cluster. And while in theory one can transition the heating for the kilns across to hydrogen, it's non-proven. actually there's opportunity in the short term to test it out and to develop the industrial infrastructure necessary to allow combustion of hydrogen in different applications. That's just one, but the same exists in many different applications. Steel manufacture, for example, is another one. So I think there is a role for grey hydrogen. It's very regionally specific, and I think it comes down to really energy availability, appetite and opportunity to sort of get into action and to develop, while then other forms of hydrogen become available.
I wouldn't disagree with anything that Oliver's just said at all. I'd note that grey hydrogen as an industry has been around for many, many years, and we shouldn't be discounting that as a catalyst to enable and accelerate the adoption of hydrogen. We should obviously be looking to turn that grey hydrogen blue wherever we can, and the same as turning the natural gas utilization blue wherever possible, but at the same time stimulating new growth through green hydrogen and other colours.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I could comment on that as well, but I'm conscious of running out of time. There's two more I'm going to try and get through. One's quite specific. It was aimed at yourself, Richard, but it was this issue around storage tanks, so specifically around steel embrittlement in steel storage tanks. Have you come across issues with that? What's the sort of, storage tanks in the processes you're looking at? What's the lifespan? And I appreciate it's a very specific question. I know we've been involved with some work with the Henry Royce Institute, who've been looking at end-to-end hydrogen materials, that this has been one of the areas they've looked at. But sorry, yeah, over to you.
No, and so storage tanks isn't one of the things that we do as our core business. But in terms of embrittlement, it certainly is an issue. And that's why we strongly believe our composite flexible pipeline technology is going to be very useful for hydrogen. It's almost perfectly suited for that application as opposed to some of the more traditional materials. And embrittlement is well known as an issue that we do have to work on, and some of the materials we're going to have to use are quite different. I think with the amount of research that's out there and the amount of understanding we now have, we should be able to overcome that relatively easily. I don't know if any of the other panelists have got experience with the specific tank storage issues, but it's not something that I've personally come across yet, Steffan.
Okay, no problem. Anybody want to comment very quickly, or is that one for another day probably? Okay, I'm just going to pick up. Conscious we've got literally a couple of minutes left. So Mark Hughes mentioned that no one's mentioned issue of government intervention and funding. So I think that came across quite a bit in Oonagh's words and slides about the industrial regions and where it needs to come in there. I suppose what I was just going to mention, very timely, but we've got two big funds that we've been waiting for. So the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund from Bayes opens today, and there's a briefing event tomorrow, and that is up to £240 million supporting the development of new low carbon hydrogen production. So that's obviously key. So very, get involved in that. There, I think last week or the week before, the Industrial Hydrogen Accelerator, also Bayes, was launched. That's 26 million, and that's more aimed at the end-to-end fuel switching for sort of industrial processes. But there's the whole of the NZIP portfolio. There's the IETF, Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which hydrogen can be a part of. I don't think we've got time to do it justice here. What I would just say to people is there are some of these key funds at the moment, and the hydrogen business model as well is one that's worth mentioning. But there are these key things that do have hydrogen in the title, and they're out there, and a lot of money's putting behind them. So please do look those up. But also there's a lot of other funding out there that might not say hydrogen in the title, but hydrogen will be relevant to it. So, feel free. I mean, any of us, I really do need to wrap up now, so you can get hold of any of us on LinkedIn. KTN are happy to help on this front as well. So if people are struggling or looking, at funding and finance options, then do please get in touch. Right, I'm really sorry we're overrunning. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. It's the first event of the week and the first day back after Easter holidays for some. Thank you, speakers. Thank you to our sponsors, AECOM. A recording will be available on the Green Infrastructure site soon. There's lots of events coming up today and over the week. And coming up at 11 a.m, we've got the World Hydrogen Leaders discussing UK's options for clean hydrogen production. So register for that or see other events at greeninfrastructureweek.com. Okay, we're bang on 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a great day and a great week.
Thanks, Steffan.